feeling off and that she wouldn't want me to touch her. Luckily, she stepped out of the Porsche and walked straight to me like she did every morning. I suppressed a frown as I noticed she looked different from just hours ago. Her eyes were darker, face sallower, cheeks sunken, and lips pale while her purple eyelids covered most of her vision. She seemed fine before she left my room, but now she looked just like she did yesterday when we parted in the parking lot after school. I smiled as she stepped into my arms and grasped my neck so tightly it nearly choked me, and I was so fucking relieved. I wrapped my arms around her waist snugly and buried my nose in her hood, finally able to touch and smell and kiss her head. Even though I enjoyed the late night visit, it was fucking unbearable to see and not touch. I grinned tightly as she released me. "Everything go okay this morning?" I asked nervously, fucking praying that she hadn't been caught by Esme. That was the last thing we needed, and I wished that I had paid the risk more attention at the time. She pursed her lips and tilted her head.
"Yeah."
She shrugged indifferently, and I expelled a breath I hadn't even realized I had been holding. She wasn't feeling off, and she didn't get busted. My girl was a fucking excellent juvenile delinquent. I smiled in relief and led her to class, anticipating lunch, and I could tell she was, too, because when my lips met her neck in front of her door, she shivered. I smiled against her skin as I released her, and watched her enter the room, shuffling and dragging her steps in a way that really fucking concerned me. She hadn't seemed that bad earlier. I shook off the feeling of unease, and went through the day as I normally would. I was spot on about my history test. Motherfucking F, it soured my mood, so I crumpled the paper in my fist, tossing it in the hall trash can as I made my way to meet Bella for lunch. When the fuck would I ever visit Indochina anyway? She was waiting for me in her seat with her head resting on her arms when I arrived. She must have heard me approach, because when I entered the doorway, her head suddenly turned, and she smiled at me knowingly. Admittedly, I had been really fucking impatient for lunch the entire day. I should have been taking her to the lunchroom so she could sleep, because she looked disturbingly exhausted, but instead, I wrapped my arm around her shoulders as she stood and led her out of the classroom, toward our familiar spot. I couldn't shoulder all the guilt, because her steps were livelier on the pavement as we approached the two buildings, just like they were every day we walked out the doors at noon. We slipped between the buildings, and I released her as we finally arrived at the location, and assumed our regular position on the ground, side by side against the wall. She smiled as she produced my brown paper bag, and I fucking rolled my eyes as I took it. I went for the cookies first, and not because I knew they'd be delicious, but because I was curious about Esme. It was common for my girl to revolve her cookie names around Esme nowadays, and I was hoping for some improvement in her attempts to break her resolve against our relationship. Of course, the name of the cookie wasn't very encouraging. Chewy Granola Grievances. I frowned at the black ink, rubbing it with my thumb as if I could wipe all the bullshit away and make everything perfect. What a fucking joke. With a sigh, Bella removed her hood, and I furrowed my brows in concern over the dull texture of her hair as I set the cookies aside. It had been so shiny last night.
"So,"
she began, as she leaned against my side with a deep yawn.
"I asked around and finally found out who the original James Bond was,"
she continued as the yawn subsided, shaking her head as she peeked at me.
"You were right. Sean Connery was the original Bond,"
she conceded in regards to a debate we had the previous day. Then she rolled her eyes at my smug expression, because fuck, Bella. Everyone knows Connery was the original Bond.
"In my defense,"
she added, all fucking indignant, rubbing her eyes from the residual yawn tears,
"Roger Moore was way better."
She shrugged and relaxed against the wall as she stretched her legs out before her. I scoffed at her ignorance and mirrored her pose as I lifted my arm, and she granted me access to her shoulders. Okay. I could spend all hour debating that horse shit. I quirked an eyebrow at her skeptically, because no fucking way was more better than Connery. But I continued as I pulled her closer and planted a kiss on her temple. I lowered my voice, all suggestive once again. "You'd probably just flash your tits to distract me from your insults on classic film." I mumbled against her skin with a smile, as my hand found her chin and tilted her face upwards. She gazed into my eyes with amusement, and her lips twitched.
"Excuse me?"
She nearly giggled, but I cut her off as I swiftly sucked her bottom lip into my mouth, and now, she was the one who was speechless. I kissed her slowly and softly, but my hand was just fucking dying to find out if she was still wearing that red bra. I hadn't touched her breasts since that last night we slept together, so I was hesitant to just fucking grope. But she sighed into my mouth and parted her lips to deepen the kiss, and the lust as our tongues met reminded me she wasn't hesitant last night about showing them.
Bella's point of view. The feel of his tongue against mine made every cell in my body spring to life, and I did back a moan as Edward's hand found my hip and pulled me closer. Best way to stay alert ever. The whole day had been a struggle, and even though I never let Edward see it, I had spent every class consuming coffee from my thermos just to stay coherent. I usually wouldn't hide the fact that I was so tired, but I knew he'd likely insist on taking me to the lunchroom to sleep, and I would be missing out on this. Our tongues intermingled languidly, and the way he gripped my hip brought a perfunctory flash of remembrance that afternoon over a month ago when he had me pressed up against the brick wall. Behind me I moaned into Edward's mouth at the memory, and he twisted his body to move closer as the flash of lust and excitement energized me minutely. He never acted like that anymore. He cupped my cheek and caressed my hair, while his tongue moved over mine gently. He was tender and loving, no longer domineering and urgent. I felt a familiar surge of guilt and shame for being confused about which version of affection I preferred. There were times I nearly considered mentioning therapy once again simply to elicit his previous reaction, until I realized how completely awful and evil that made me, which yet again made my chest swell with guilt and confusion. Truthfully, I was too tired to expend the necessary mental effort of working through the complex meanings behind it all, so I let him kiss me like this, and I loved every second of his reverent adoration of my lips and face and hair. I had to push away the urge to spur on his more urgent personality. His hand began creeping up my side, and I angled my body towards him to weave my fingers in the back of his hair. He smiled into the kiss as his hand descended, and I was momentarily confused at his amusement until his hand suddenly grasped my breast. I gasped in surprise, and he pulled away slightly, opening his eyes to meet my gaze with a grin as he licked his lips and massaged my breast in his palm lazily. His eyes were so dark, and I was immediately concerned with how they seemed so unfocused. Nearly moving from side to side as his nose nudged mine lightly, and I moaned involuntarily. He hadn't touched me like this in too long, and it was beginning to make my blood boil as my breathing grew deeper. He took my moan as encouragement, and quickly moved his hand down to the hem of my hoodie, slipping it underneath while his lips went to my neck. I tilted it to give him better access, as his cold hand slid up my torso to my breast once again.
He
hummed against my neck, and I was biting my lip as his thumb rubbed my nipple over the fabric.
You changed out of the red one, but I don't give a fuck.
He mumbled into my skin and dipped his fingers beneath my bra, surprising me again as I gasped and arched into his hand involuntarily.
They all look better on my floor anyways.
He chuckled throatily and continued massaging. I battled the urge to climb into his lap as I hummed at the sensations of his hand. "What's with the sudden interest in my undergarments?" I asked distractedly while nuzzling his hair and pushing him closer. I was thankful for his boldness, because I really love the light kissing, but had decided that this was way better.
You were so fucking cruel last night.
He groaned into my neck as I arched against him again to get closer.
I hope you realize I failed that test because of these.
He muttered, and alternated to my other breast as I moaned. I weaved my fingers into his hair, and furrowed my brows in confusion. "What?" I asked breathlessly as his teeth grazed my earlobe.
You'll have to tell me how you managed to get past Carlisle's security system.
He breathed huskily against my ear.
Because fuck, Bella. I've been trying to do that shit for years.
He whispered, and returned his lips to my neck, while massaging me, and his tongue met my skin, and almost distracted me thoroughly, but I managed to pull back infinitesimally. I met his hooded gaze, and he was still licking his lips, and groping me as I furrowed my brows in confusion. "What the hell are you talking about?" I asked as I attempted to back away, and resist the pleasure of his hand trapped firmly between my flesh and my bra. His lips turned up into a smirk, and he dove for my neck once again.
"Don't pretend like you can't remember that striptease."
He snickered drowsily into my skin, and I tried pulling away once more. "What?" I repeated my inquiry weakly, because I was utterly lost in this conversation, and his hands weren't helping my focus. He shook his head against my neck with another deep chuckle, and didn't cease the movement of his hand. It felt good. Very good. I was nearly resigned to dropping this odd conversation before I thought better of it, but when I tried to pull away again, his lips and tongue were on my neck, and I began getting frustrated. I put my hands on his shoulders, and attempted to push him back, but he didn't budge, so I did the only thing I knew with certainty would work. "Cookie," I blurted sharply, and perhaps more irritably than intended. His hand immediately withdrew from my bra and hoodie, as he lurched back with a part groan, part growl, and resumed his position against the wall. His eyes were heavy and tight as his hand raked through his hair, and he scowled blankly ahead. I straightened my bra and hoodie, and frowned at his frustrated expression. "What happened last night?" I asked softly, tilting my head, and reaching for his hand. I hated frustrating him, and using the safe word for purposes that were unrelated to my panic was really unfair. It felt like the boy crying wolf, or something. He huffed, and allowed me to take his hand as he met my gaze, and quirked an eyebrow.
"You sneaking in my bedroom, taking off your shirt, tough to be, ring any bells?"
He spoke in a harsh tone and raised his eyebrows expectantly. I gazed into his eyes for many moments to determine whether or not he was joking with me, or if I had become so sleepy that I simply misunderstood his words. But he looked serious. He was still scowling. "Edward," I started, and cleared my throat, because it felt tight, and I had no idea what was going on. "I never left my bedroom last night," I whispered in an apologetic voice, while gripping his hand, and attempting to soothe him with a gentle caress of my thumb. His flushed lips abruptly curled up into a smile, gazing back at me with an unexpectedly bemused expression. Mine remained unchanged as I stroked his hand, and searched his green eyes in confusion. As he stared at my lost expression for many moments, his smile slowly faded to a tight line, and his brows furrowed softly.
"Stop fucking with me,"
he whispered, and gently pulled his hand away. I must have been gaping at him. "I'm serious," I insisted, feeling rather insulted that he didn't believe me, but Edward scoffed in return, and eyed me suspiciously. I grew frustrated as I recalled my nightly routine aloud. I made cookies at 8, I was in bed by 9, I read 4 chapters of my book, I used my bathroom at 3:27, and then I went back under my blankets until the sun rose, and I never even left my bedroom, Edward. My frustration steadily shifted to alarm as the words left my mouth, and he grew visibly upset. I gazed into his agitated green eyes for many moments, uncertain of what to make of this. His face remained hard, and the now constant crease in his forehead deepened as his eyes still held that oddly unfocused movement. Suddenly, he sprang up off the ground, and his eyes grew furious, as he snatched up his bag, and turned to me with a glower. He pointed his finger accusingly at where I sat.
"Are completely full of shit,"
he spat, turning on his heel, and storming to the path between the buildings as I stared after him in shock. It took me a while to regain any rational thought, before I stood and had the presence of mind to approach the lunchroom in search of him, but as I entered the door, and looked at the table, I noticed Edward's seat was vacant. I leaned out the open door and glanced at the parking lot, before I realized his car was missing. Still confused, and admittedly, a little hurt, I entered the lunchroom, and made a beeline to Alice, because I had to figure out what was going on. "You want what?" she asked incredulously as I shifted from foot to foot anxiously at her side. I groaned in frustration, lacking the patience and energy to engage Alice in an argument. "Alice, please. I know how to drive a car.